Hi, my name's Mark Gober. I'm the author of the books An End to Upside Down Thinking and An End to Upside Down Living. I'm also on the board of directors at the Institute of Noetic Sciences. I'll start off by telling a bit about my background and how I became interested in the general topic of consciousness, and then I'll move to why I think these topics are so important, not only for each of us individually, but also for society as a whole. So my books are on the topic of consciousness and the nature of reality, but my background is actually in business. After graduating from Princeton, I went into investment banking in New York during the financial crisis, and then spent 10 years at a Silicon Valley strategy firm where I became a partner advising technology companies on their innovation, business strategy, and very mainstream topics. I wasn't thinking about the nature of reality all that much, but in 2016, I listened to podcasts that exposed me to new ideas and really challenged my worldview. And that led to research, which ultimately led to my writing books. So the main premise of what I write about and speak about is related to consciousness, which is our subjective experience. It's our sense of awareness. So anyone right now listening to this or watching this has a consciousness that's experiencing that. Our consciousness is not something that we can touch, but it is very important because it's the basis of all experience. And what I was shocked to learn in my research is that science does not understand consciousness, that we know consciousness exists, but we don't understand where it comes from. And many people assume that consciousness comes from the brain somehow, even though the brain is a physical structure, whereas our consciousness is not something we can touch, it's not physical. Mainstream science tends to assume that it must be the case that the brain creates consciousness. And what I've done in my research is accumulated lots of scientific evidence done by smart scientists around the world, which suggests that our consciousness actually isn't coming from our brain or from our body, but rather it's the other way around, that consciousness is the fundamental aspect underlying all physical reality, and our body and our brains actually emerge within consciousness. So for me, this was a big worldview shift because I used to think that consciousness comes from the brain. When you die, there's no consciousness anymore. And life is meaningless. We're in a random universe. When you die, it's over. And there's no real meaning to life beyond what you make it out to be. But in the end, there's no intrinsic meaning in life. And here I was confronted with science that challenged that worldview, that maybe our consciousness is infinite and the body is just a temporary stop. So an analogy I like to use comes from Dr. Bernardo Kastrup, a philosopher in this area, who says that all reality could be likened to an infinite stream of water, where water represents consciousness. And each of us is like a whirlpool within that stream, meaning we're a localization of the water. We feel like we're an individual as a whirlpool, but we're fundamentally interconnected to the whole, even though our eyes don't show us that on a day-to-day basis. Now, if that were true, imagine if some of the water from my whirlpool got into your whirlpool. That would be like some of my consciousness entering yours. And that would be like a psychic or a telepathic effect. So this model predicts that psychic phenomena would be real and not paranormal. Another implication of this model is that when a whirlpool stops being a whirlpool, the water simply just flows back into the stream. The whirlpool delocalizes. The water doesn't leave the stream. It simply transitions into a new state. And analogously, this is sort of like when the physical body dies, all that happens to our consciousness is that it transitions into something different. Meaning, this model predicts that when our body dies, our consciousness does not. So much of the science that I aggregate points to the reality of psychic phenomena and the survival of consciousness beyond bodily death. And I reason that if any of these phenomena are real, we can explain it very easily if consciousness is this fundamental aspect of reality. Whereas if we say consciousness comes from the brain, that isn't going to be able to account for these phenomena. So I'll very briefly touch on some of the scientific evidence, even though there's a ton that I've covered elsewhere. On the topic of psychic phenomena, so things like telepathy, which is mind-to-mind communication, precognition, which is knowing or sensing the future before it happens, remote viewing, which is the ability to see something with the mind alone that's far away in space and or time, and psychokinesis, which is the ability for mind to impact matter. These are phenomena that in an everyday science course would be called impossible, according to science. But in fact, there's a lot of statistical evidence that these are real phenomena, which I was shocked to learn about. In 2018, Lund University professor Dr. Etzel Cardenia published a paper in American Psychologist, which is the official peer-reviewed academic journal of the American Psychological Association. And it looked at the accumulated statistics for all these psychic phenomena over decades of research. And what he found is that there is a real statistical effect, and this mainstream journal published the paper, which to me is very powerful because this is a controversial area that many people have disputed over the years. And in spite of all that, the statistics were good enough that the paper was allowed. And I'll give another one of my favorite examples. This comes from Dr. Jessica Utz, who in 2016 was the president of the American Statistical Association. She was giving a presentation to US Congress and the CIA about the US government's psychic spying program, which I was also shocked to hear about, which spanned for roughly 2 decades. $25 million or so were spent on it. So this was a real program for national security. Dr. Utz was asked about the reality of psychic phenomena. And what she said is, using the standards applied to any other area of science, it is concluded that psychic functioning has been well established. A very strong statement from a woman who ran the American Statistical Association. And one final example from Dr. Dean Radin, the chief scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences. He has looked at the statistics also for these 4 areas: telepathy, precognition, remote viewing, psychokinesis, and has shown that they are at the level of 6 sigma statistical results, meaning that the odds that these things are occurring just by chance is more than 1 billion to 1 against chance. So in other areas of science, the psychic ability would have been already established and probably welcomed, but because it's so controversial, it hasn't been quite yet. Now, that's just the psychic phenomena category, and already there's a lot of strong evidence. In terms of survival of bodily death, there's also a lot of strong evidence, which I'll very briefly cover. One is the notion of a near-death experience, where a person has some kind of physiological trauma. It might be cardiac arrest, for example, where the heart stops beating, there's no blood flowing to the brain, little, if any, brain functioning at all. And yet some people report hovering over their bodies, seeing things that occurred in the room, sometimes outside the room. And then when they're resuscitated, they report what happened, and sometimes it's accurate. So this is an instance where it's called a veridical out-of-body experience, where what the person sees at a time when the brain shouldn't be capable of producing such a complex cognition, the person reports it accurately. So this is an accurate memory that occurs at a time when the brain isn't functioning properly. And an accurate memory is, by definition, not a hallucination. And so there's a number of pieces of evidence which suggest that these phenomena are examples where the consciousness is functioning even when the body is not. And I'll give one of my favorite quotes from Dr. Bruce Grayson from the University of Virginia. He says about near-death experiences, "We're left with this paradox that at a time when the brain isn't functioning, the mind is functioning better than ever." And this points to a broader phenomenon, which is that consciousness is well beyond the body. There's water outside the whirlpool, but our brain actually limits and restricts what we perceive. So it's a reversal of the conventional thinking that the brain is what's creating consciousness. I and others are arguing actually the brain is a processing mechanism and even a filter, sort of like a filter of consciousness. Another area of research is known as mediumship or after-death communication research. This is the alleged ability to communicate with the deceased. The Windbridge Research Center has run studies on this, particularly with mediums, where they test whether an alleged medium can know information about a deceased person that we can't explain due to chance. And they've run some preliminary studies that have been published in peer-reviewed journals. We obviously need more research, but the preliminary studies suggest that indeed mediums can get information about dead people that we cannot explain through normal means. And these are studies using 5 levels of blinding. So the initial evidence there is, I think, important to look at. And the final example I'll give under this survival of bodily death category is children who remember previous lives. And this is referring to research done at the University of Virginia for over 50 years, where they've examined over 2,500 cases of young children, usually between the ages of 2 and 5 years old, who report memories of a life that is not their own. And in the strongest cases, the researchers are able to find a person that aligns with what the child is describing. So someone actually lived the life that this child is describing, and sometimes the details are so specific that it's difficult to explain other than to say that somehow the consciousness from the deceased person is now into the body of a child. And in some cases, the child even has birthmarks or physical defects that align with the way in which the previous person died in the past life. So there seems to be some kind of transference from one life to the next, which again suggests that consciousness is well beyond the body. So all this is to say that if consciousness is much more than we've been taught in school, if consciousness really is this fundamental aspect of reality, then we as a society need to think about meaning in life and what we're really here to do. And this notion of interconnectedness, if we're really all part of the same stream of consciousness, that's a very significant idea, because that means that all separation that we see with our eyes really doesn't exist at some other level of reality. And one example I'll give to exemplify this idea of an interconnectedness, and Erwin Schrödinger, the Nobel Prize winning physicist, said, "In truth, there is only one mind, this one stream of consciousness." And we see this in the near-death experience, specifically in the life review phenomenon. So in the near-death experience, which, as I explained, is likely not a hallucination caused by a dying brain, if we accept that it's not a hallucination, then it would logically follow that we should examine what people report during the state when their brain's basically off, because it might tell us something about the broader reality. And in fact, what we've seen over the years is that many people come back from the near-death experience talking about a life review, where they relived events in their life. And not only do they relive those events in a short amount of time, they relive them through the eyes of the people that they impacted. One of my favorite examples is that of Dannion Brinkley, who had 4 near-death experiences in his life, and each time he had a life review. What he has said is that he relived his combat days in Vietnam, and he was vicious in combat apparently. So during his life review, he relived the death of the person that he killed through that person's eyes, and then he felt the pain of the child that would no longer have a father because he had killed the father in combat. So when he was resuscitated, his life changed completely. He went from being a very materialistic person to now thinking about how he was treating people, because he saw in the life review what you seem to care about as you're watching your own life is how you treated people. Did you bring joy to people, or did you bring pain to the people? And sometimes it's the little things that matter in life rather than the things that we think matter based on what society might tell us, like how big our house is or what kind of car we drive. Those are not the things that people are talking about in the life review. Instead, they're looking at their behavior and even the small interactions, like how they interacted with the cashier and how that interaction could have impacted every other person in line afterwards. So it shows this life review phenomenon. I think it's an extremely important case because it's like the one mind in action. It's this one consciousness switching lenses in an alternate dimension of reality. Whereas when we're in the body, we're seeing life through the one whirlpool. When consciousness is liberated from the brain, we're able to switch lenses somehow and experience the oneness, experience the one mind. Now just imagine for a second this one concept of a singular interconnected consciousness that we're all a part of. If many people in the world adopted that idea, how would that change our behavior? And I think it goes from all parts of society. If we think about political leaders, business leaders, people in education, if these were the priorities, thinking about how they're treating others, because literally altruism is a form of selfishness at the level of this one mind consciousness, priorities would automatically shift. It would become irrational to do harm to others, and it would become completely irrational to start caring about others much more, in addition to caring about ourselves and making sure that we're taking care of our own bodies and our own lives, because we're part of the one consciousness too. So this idea, which initially started out as a scientific conversation of looking at consciousness and the brain and psychic abilities and survival of bodily death and whether or not there's evidence for it, ultimately the implications here are for all of society, well beyond science. And that's the point I hope to get across here, that if each of us, every day, if we think maybe there's a life review, maybe there's a small % chance that some or all of us will have a life review when we leave the physical body, if that's really part of this interconnected reality, how are we going to treat all of our interactions each day? And that's what I will leave you with, and thanks for listening.